Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. When we were 18, my friends and I played the staircase game. I didn't think any of us would get alive. One Saturday night, when we were young and bored and felt invincible, my friends and I decided to play the staircase game. To play this game, you need a black staircase and at least 3 people. To win this game, you have to finish walking down all 5 staircases. There are only 4 rules. 1. Once you start to play the game, you can't quit. 2. You have to walk down the stairs backwards. 3. While you're on a staircase, you are not allowed to talk to anyone. 4. While you're walking down the staircase, never ever let go of your travel companion's hands. Simple, right? We thought so too. My best friend Margot was the one who ultimately convinced us to play. Left to our own devices, Jonathan and I would have spent our entire summer in front of the TV. Content to stay there until our respective college orientations started. As Margot put it, you would have just re-watched the same boring shows, played the same boring board games, and gossiped about the same boring people. Margot was the kind of person who was going places. She had her whole life mapped out, from her college major to her 10-year career goals. Frankly, she was a terrifying force of nature. For example, when we were 12 years old and still naively believed in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy, our parents took us to see the mall Santa. Margot argued with Santa for 15 minutes straight about why the nice and naughty lists were unfair and didn't account for the nuance. Cowed and beaten, he finally told her that he would take her feedback into account and create the neutral list. Margot and I had been best friends for nearly all our lives. To anyone else looking in from the outside, our friendship was impossible. Margot was brilliant, passionate, and outspoken. She took so many AP classes she set a new record at our school. And she always knew exactly what she wanted to do and how to do it. In comparison to her, I meandered through life in a perpetual daze. Standing next to Margot, I was so quiet that people sometimes forgot I existed. My parents would gaze at us and shake their heads in puzzlement. Well, they do say that opposites attract. My dad once said weakly. At the end of the day, it didn't matter what other people thought. Our friendship rested on the solid bedrock that was our mutual love for all things horror and the paranormal. We exchanged online scary stories late at night instead of sleeping, watched new horror movies and TV shows together constantly, and frequented paranormal discussion forums in between our classes. Instead of clashing, we evened each other out. I'd never thought it would be possible for anyone to come between us. Which brings me to Jonathan. He transferred to our high school at the start of senior year, a time when most friendships had already weathered countless adolescent storms and were set in stone. Everyone noticed him because he was tall, dark, and handsome, but he seemed arrogant and aloof. Instead of approaching anyone, he kept to himself and read books during lunchtime. One day, we accidentally bumped into one another, sending his books flying. Stephen King, Paul Tremblay, Stephen Graham Jones, and Sylvia Moreno Garcia. While I helped him pick them up, I asked him what his favorite Stephen King book was. And just like that, we became friends. It turned out that he wasn't arrogant at all, just incredibly shy. His friendship was the missing puzzle piece that completed Margot's and mine. His dry humor and dark jokes fit right in. And of course, he was wildly in love with Margot. How do I know that? Because she's drop-dead gorgeous. She had long brunette hair that she often tied into a French braid and dark gray eyes. I saw the way his face lit up and the glances he sent her way. Jonathan's voice interrupted my thoughts. Are we really going to do this? It'd be so much less work to just lie on the couch all day. He brushed a hand through his dark curls and gave us that lopsided grin of his. The one that made my stomach do a flip. Margot had led us to the pantry in her enormous house. Shelves groaned with the weight of cans and jars. Rice and pasta, and other food items stacked all the way up to the ceiling. If there was ever an earthquake, whoever stood in here would be buried alive under all that food. Of course we are, said Margot, and then she softened, looking at us pleadingly. Guys, I want an adventure. You know my parents. If they had their way, they'd bundle me up in bubble wrap and lock me in a safe. Sadly, she was right. Mr. and Mrs. Auden were fiercely protective of Margot. We suspected that protectiveness stemmed from her sister's death. Mary Ann drowned in their pool while Mr. Auden was on a business call. They hadn't found her body until it was too late. Margot had only been 3 years old at the time. Mary Ann 5, so Margot didn't remember much about her. I wondered sometimes whether Margot tried so hard to be the best at everything because she wanted to make up for the fact that her sister would never get to do anything. She led 2 lives. The life she wanted and the life her sister should have had. I know it's silly. Everyone else who's celebrating the end of our senior year is going on road trips or traveling abroad. All my parents are letting me do is sit on the couch. I can't even attend a pool party. She took a deep breath, her eyes shining with tears. I want to do this, and it would mean a lot to me if we did it together. Even if nothing happens, I don't know. Aren't you a little curious? Yes, of course I am, I said as I hugged her. Jonathan came over too, so we were all in one another's arms for a few seconds. Truth, I was curious about the staircase game. The first time I had ever seen someone mention it was back in the late 2000s. That post had been taken down, but not before Margot and I agreed that it sounded intriguing. A handful of other posts on those paranormal discussion forums we loved so much detailed users' experiences with the game. According to those posts, each of the 5 staircases would be 100 steps. The posts advised us to count the steps to make sure we were on the right staircase because sometimes the game tried to trick you. Additionally, every staircase would be a different color. The first one was always black. Then, the rest of the staircases would be red, gray, blue, white, in any order. Each staircase supposedly took you to a different dimension. Strangely, none of the posts described what happened after you went down the first staircase. All of them did agree on one thing though: we should bring flashlights, food, and water with us. So, we were in the pantry. You might be wondering why we took this game so seriously. As I've said, Margot and I loved scary things. Together, we tried nearly all the weird shit you've read online. We trespassed on abandoned asylums, visited haunted houses, and slept at cemeteries overnight. But our speciality. What we did the most in our free time was playing supernatural games. We played the elevator game, light as a feather, Suji Ura, the corner game, Daruma-san, and more. We had never been able to play the staircase game before because it had been just the two of us. Over the past few years, as we dabbled in these games, my belief in the paranormal had faded to a pale imitation of what it once was. Like a fire slowly dying out into embers. Nothing had ever happened to us. Not once. I wasn't sure if Margot still believed in the paranormal either. Still, it was a fun hobby. This would be Jonathan's first time doing anything like this. Senior year had been too busy for Margot and me to get up to our normal shenanigans. SAT prep classes, the SATs, college applications, homecoming preparations, and the time-honored tradition of playing a senior prank had occupied all our free time. I tried not to think about the fact that Margot and Jonathan would both be at Stanford in the fall. Margot majoring in econ and Jonathan in biology. Margot had considered going to Yale until her parents made noises about moving to New Haven with her. Meanwhile, the only place that accepted me was our local community college. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against attending community college, just this specific one. Everyone at our high school, and I do mean everyone, joked about how bad it was. I still hadn't told my friends where I was going. The disappointment on my parents' faces was bad enough. I said, if we're doing this, let's get started. Maybe we'll be back in time to check out that new Korean show trending on Netflix. Okay, said Margot. With one foot, she shoved the heavy black backpack with all our supplies towards Jonathan, who picked it up as if it weighed nothing. Let's head over to the basement stairs. A few years ago, someone had slopped black paint all over the basement stairs. Okay, I admit it. That someone was Margot and I back when we first heard that you needed a black staircase to play the staircase game. Her parents had been furious. We stood on the basement stairs gazing down into the darkness. Personally, I wasn't a fan of the dark, and basements have always seemed creepy to me. I knew it was a childish fear, the kind you're supposed to outgrow. But that didn't really help. It just made me feel stupid for having a nightlight in my bedroom. Well, said Margot, it's now or never. She held out her hands to mine. Wait, said Jonathan, suddenly serious. If this game is real, then I should walk down first, in front of you guys. Just as I was about to tell Jonathan that the staircase game probably wasn't real, I saw the vulnerability on Margot's face. That expression answered my question as to whether or not Margot still believed in the paranormal. Unlike me, she had more to lose if it didn't actually exist. Why do over 4 in 10 Americans believe in the existence of supernatural beings? Because they do exist. Or maybe because we all have cognitive biases, patternicity, pareidolia, a form of apophenia, and confirmation bias. In other words, we make connections in meaningless data or between unrelated events, and we interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Of course, I knew why Margot continued to believe in the paranormal. Marianne, it's a human impulse to try to make sense of a senseless tragedy. To dissect it endlessly so that you can figure out what exactly happened and why. If you admit that there is no fate, no purpose or order to anything in this world, then everything bad that has happened to you so far means nothing. The death of a loved one, an abusive relationship, bullying from classmates or colleagues. It's pure chance that you survived. Some people, like Margot, had a hard time coping with that. We linked our hands. Jonathan went first, then Margot, and then myself. Any last words? Jonathan joked. None of us said anything. I didn't know what Margot was thinking about. I stared down into the darkness and my eyes strained to make out any shapes or movement. "Let's do this," said Margot finally, with her usual certainty, and we walked down the first staircase together. Staircase 1. I watched the light from the doorway vanish as the darkness pressed down on us. In a matter of seconds, it was so dark that I could no longer see the steps I had already walked past. I kept imagining monsters in the darkness. Monsters with gleaming yellow eyes who waited impatiently for us to descend further down the stairs. My hand sweated in Margot's grip and I longed to discreetly wipe it off on my shorts. Unfortunately, per the rules of the game, I couldn't let go yet. I took a quick moment to be devoutly thankful that it wasn't Jonathan's hand in mine. We walked and walked. It was hard to tell how far we'd gone, especially since walking backwards down the steps disoriented me. Yet I still felt that we should have reached the end of the staircase by now. Even though I wasn't that familiar with this basement, common sense said that an object couldn't be bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. I.e., the TARDIS is a lie. I chanced a glance over my shoulder to see how far we still had to go and nearly fell over in shock. Instead of the darkness I expected to see, there was a bright light below us right where the staircase ended. I swerved alarmingly towards what was probably a steep drop. My fingers brushed the air, unable to find the railing that was supposed to be there. I caught my balance at the last second and heard Margot gasp behind me. I had almost brought her down with me. A perfect metaphor for our friendship. The words, "I'm sorry," were actually on the tip of my tongue just as the stupid rules came back to me at the last second. Instead of saying anything into the darkness, I simply squeezed Margot's hand in apology. She squeezed mine back. I began counting the steps as we went down. I should have done that from the start, but I hadn't thought that the staircase game was real. Even now, I wasn't completely convinced. I don't think anyone would have been, aside from Margot. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Is a longer than normal staircase and a bright light at the end of it enough to shatter years of conviction about the way the world works? But as we drew closer to the light, I did start to believe that the game was real. The light showed us the details of our surroundings and I could see that we were most definitely not in a basement anymore. I heard our footsteps and dripping water echo in the darkness. I had the impression we were in some giant hollow cave. Air currents brushed my face. Weirdly, I even heard birds chirping. Although why they were awake in the darkness, no idea. By the time the staircase ended, I counted 57 steps. That seemed about right, since I hadn't started counting from the beginning. We went through a doorway and stood around blinking the spots from our eyes, trying to adjust to the sudden contrast from darkness to bright light. Bright sunlight? That didn't make any sense. Yet as my vision cleared, I realized we stood outside in the middle of a vast desert. Shining golden sand surrounded almost everything. The exception was a long black road stretching ahead of us. That road gleamed under the sun like some sleeping obsidian snake. And, set along the road at equidistant intervals from each other, suspended in the air without any visible support, floated the doors. There were doors of all kinds and sizes. Some seemed like normal wooden doors, only painted in eye-watering shades from neon pink to a blinding yellow. Some were large enough for a Boeing 747 to fly through. Others so tiny none but a mouse could pass. A handful of them were made of the oddest materials, from stone to glass to what seemed like steel. The only thing all the doors had in common was their bronze doorknobs. Those attached to stone doors looked particularly out of place. I turned to the black road. Sand dunes blocked portions of it from view, and the heat was so intense that the very air shimmered. From what I could make out, the road ended in another door. Great. Even though I was afraid, confused, and overwhelmingly anxious, part of me, the part that had never stopped believing in the paranormal, rejoiced. Finally, something had happened to us. Something that couldn't be easily explained away by natural causes. Probably, maybe, this can't be real, whispered Jonathan. He let the backpack drop to his feet and stared around wildly. The blood had drained from his face, leaving his dark skin pale. This is impossible, Margot said. Don't you see? She was transported with a kind of savage joy. It took me aback because that was the expression you expected to see on some unhinged religious leader's face as he preached to his flock about the end of days. It's real. The staircase game is real. She laughed wildly. If I had heard that laugh while in the dark, I would have been afraid. Okay, I said, made uneasy. It's real. I turned to search behind us for the staircase that had brought us here, and saw nothing but more desert. The door to the staircase had disappeared. Jesus fucking Christ. The staircase game was real. It's gone, said Jonathan, voicing my thoughts. Margot didn't appear to hear us. She strode forward and literally left us in her dust. Jonathan and I stared in confusion. And then we ran after her. I could hear the cans clinking around in Jonathan's backpack. The heat was so intense that I was sweating even in my tank top and shorts. Either I just ate the worst pot brownie of my life, Jonathan said, panting, or I'm having a psychotic break from reality and I'm imagining all of this. I couldn't respond because I had to use all my breath for running. I wasn't used to running on hilly terrain and the road hurt my feet. I was wearing thin-soled sneakers. I leaned down to examine the road and realized that it wasn't smooth. Black obsidian stones comprised it, similar to a cobblestone road. By the time we finally caught up with Margot, a stitch burned in my side and I sounded like I was close to death. I felt close to death. Slow down, I wheezed. I wanted to curl up in the fetal position, but Margot just kept on marching forward, forcing us to match her pace. We can't, said Margot impatiently. She wasn't looking at us but straight ahead. Don't you remember the post by Pharos 7921? No. We only have a certain amount of time per floor. If we aren't quick enough, the next staircase will disappear and we'll be trapped here. Fresh adrenaline shot through my veins as I thought about being trapped in this weird desert. Now that Margot mentioned it, I did remember Pharos' post and was annoyed at myself for forgetting. He hadn't specified exactly how long we had to find the next staircase, but he had been very clear that we needed to find it as soon as possible. You don't want to be there after the staircase disappears." He'd written. Margot's urgency instantly made total sense. As we trudged along, passing around the water bottle we had brought, I waited for something terrifying to happen. But nothing did. The road was strange, and the differently sized doors kind of creepy. But otherwise, it was just a desert devoid of any other life. Eventually, as incredible as it may sound to you, I became bored. I guess it's true that humans can get used to anything. The heat remained relentless, and I began to daydream about going to a nice, cool, air-conditioned mall. I imagined sitting at the food court directly under a vent with a giant smoothie in my hands. I was so lost in this daydream that when Jonathan tapped my shoulder, I flinched back as if he'd hit me. "Sorry," he said, "but do you hear that?" Actually, yes. Now that I was paying attention, I heard the strangest noise. We glanced back and saw that all the doors behind us rattled and vibrated, as if something was trying to get through them. By then, we were nearly at the road's end. We could see that the road led to a red wooden door. "Run," said Margot, her calm tone at odds with the fear in her eyes. We took off in a sprint. I hardly felt the heat anymore or the stones on the road that jabbed my feet. What stitch in my side? I was suddenly sure that I could run for hours. It's amazing what fear does. Along the stretch of road we hadn't crossed yet, the doors there began to rattle as well. The sound of knocking and meaty thuds filled the air. The doors trembled and shivered as if things on the other side were ramming their way through. The second to last door, right next to the red one that was our destination, began to buckle under the weight of whatever was pushing it as I watched. It splintered in half. "Go!" I screamed. Margot reached the door first. She slapped at the doorknob, trying to open it, and then rammed the door with her shoulder. Jonathan pushed his way forward and simply turned the doorknob counterclockwise. We all piled through the door as it opened, our hands clutching at each other. As before, Jonathan was first and I was last. Because I was last, and facing the still open door, I saw what broke through the door closest to us. Splinters flew through the air as the door finally gave away under the tremendous force battering it down. I saw them walk towards us as we backed down the staircase. They were beautiful, with shining white skin and hair. No, they were horrifying. Their faces were the faces of praying mantises. They opened their mouths to scream at us, and I saw two sets of jaws, both filled with sharp teeth made for rending and tearing flesh, and too big for their triangular faces. And then they were heart-stoppingly lovely again, with liquid, dough-like eyes. I blinked, reeling from all the different images. I looked yet again and saw that their corpse-pale bodies had been starved to thinness. I could count every single rib. They staggered towards us and held out their hands, beseeching. My mind began to buckle under the strain of trying to make sense of them. Their appearances flickered back and forth, lovely to ugly, monstrous to beautiful, over and over again. I somehow knew that if I didn't stop looking at them, I would go insane. But even with that knowledge, I couldn't tear my gaze away. My eyes burned, as if the very sight of them was cooking my eyeballs in their sockets. The last thing I saw before the red door slammed shut on us, leaving us in the blessed darkness, was that they had the arms and legs of giant spiders. They lunged at us and the hooks on those limbs scratched frantically at the closed door. The sound of the angry buzzing faded the further down we walked. All three of us panted raggedly from our flight and from residual terror. We couldn't speak to one another though. Not on these steps. I wanted to tell Margot and Jonathan that we had made a terrible mistake in starting a game we couldn't quit. I wanted to say that I worried we wouldn't all make it out alive. 4 more staircases to go, I thought, and I was afraid. Staircase 2. As we walked down the second staircase, that same darkness full of lively birdsong surrounded us again. The birdsong sounded even more wildly out of place than before. I wanted badly to talk about what I had just seen. The shapes that had been so beautiful and horrible at the same time. But I couldn't say anything aloud while on the stairs. Not without breaking one of the rules of the staircase game. So to distract myself, I counted off the steps. It should have reassured me that the only thing I could hear was our ragged breathing. Instead, I kept thinking about the claws scratching at the door. Would we have enough time to run if they broke the door down? All too soon, we arrived at the end of the staircase. Jonathan pulled open the door ahead and we stepped out. Onto a moonlit beach. We stood at the edge of a vast ocean. Moonlight turned the waves black and they lapped at us, stealing the sand from under our feet. A salty wind swept over us, though instead of bringing the briny smell I expected, it brought something sweet and metallic instead. Wait, a horrible thought crossed my mind, one provoked by the familiarity of that scent. I bent down to inspect the ocean more closely and instantly knew that we did not stand in water. "Now can we talk about what's going on?" asked Jonathan. "I need to throw up," I replied, and stumbled away from the sea of blood around us. There were tall cliffs set further back on the beach. They reminded me of the white cliffs of Dover. Not just because of their beauty but because of the sense of history they held. These cliffs had stood here on the beach for 500 billion years already, and would continue to do so for another 500 billion years. No matter what else happened, staring at those cliffs, I somehow knew that great and terrible wars had been fought here. The blood of slain armies had stained the ocean red, transforming it into what it now was. After emptying my stomach of everything I had eaten for lunch, breakfast, and dinner from last night, I walked back just in time to see Margot and Jonathan arguing fiercely, practically shouting in each other's faces. "You need to get a grip," snapped Margot, as if Jonathan was a recalcitrant toddler. "We don't have time for your hysterics. I'm sorry I didn't tell you more about the game in advance. But we have to focus on finding the next staircase before we're stuck here." "It's more than that, Margot. What else aren't you telling us about this game?" I instinctively did what I always do. Act as the peacemaker between Margot and whoever she was arguing with. "Hey, stop fighting. We're all freaking out here. Let's take a deep breath and step back." As usual, everyone ignored me. Margot looked right past me at Jonathan and said frostily, "I've told you everything I know. Winning the game is how we get back home. So can we get on with this?" Jonathan gave her a disgusted look. "You love this. You love the fact that we're trapped in some kind of horror movie right now. You don't actually give a fuck about going home. If it was up to you, we'd stay here forever." Jonathan turned away and waded deeper into the sea. I hurried after him. "Jonathan, wait, where are you going?" There's a door over there. It must lead to the next staircase. Right? Said Jonathan bitterly, pointing at a seemingly empty patch of darkness. The waves hid what he pointed at, yet when I kept my eyes trained there, in between one wave and the next, I saw the gray door. It was half submerged, only the very top of it visible. Then it was gone again, obscured from view. I had no idea how Jonathan had even managed to spot it in the first place. The tide pulled me further away from the safety of the beach. Jonathan was tall enough that the water, or rather blood, only hit his thighs. Meanwhile, I was already chest deep in it. If I wanted to keep moving forward, I would have to swim, which I really didn't want to do. I imagined ducking my head under all that thick blood and being completely surrounded by it, feeling it pressed against my face like something alive. I took one tiny step further in and stopped. Against all logic, the blood felt warm against my skin instead of cold. That was better though, wasn't it? How much worse would it be to have to swim in cold or cooling blood? We've wasted enough time, said Margot, coming up to stand beside me. You know we're standing in blood, right? She dove in without a reply or any hesitation, though I saw her grimace as the blood washed over her. I don't think I can do this, I thought, but they were already more than 20 feet ahead of me. Apparently I was the only one who had a problem diving into a literal sea of blood. I took another tiny step forward, and this time a wave lifted me right off my feet and bowled me over. The current curled around me and tugged me forward like an impatient child. I swam, doing my best to not think about what I was swimming in. It was weirdly similar to swimming in water, so I concentrated on moving forward, slicing my arms through the blood and paddling my feet, and tried not to dwell on the taste of iron in my mouth. I really didn't want to get left behind. Something brushed my ankle. Seaweed? I scoffed at myself. What could live in a sea of blood? Then again, technically none of this was possible. The posts said the staircases took us to different dimensions. What if the very laws of nature differed from dimension to dimension? What if the staircases took us to a place so different from our own world that the air itself was toxic to us? Or the gravity tripled and crushed us all into a pulp? Preoccupied with my thoughts, I hardly noticed when something brushed my feet again. And then what was unmistakably a hand closed around my ankles and started to drag me downwards. Stupidly, I opened my mouth to scream for help and of course blood filled it. I swallowed convulsively without thinking and gagged. Thank God I had already emptied the contents of my stomach, otherwise, if I had had anything else to throw up then, I would have. The blood closed over me and I couldn't see anything. I struggled to break free of the iron grip around my ankles, pummeling at whatever held my ankles. It let go of me. I swam up towards the distant moonlight, my lungs aching with the need to suck in great lungfuls of air. My head broke the surface right as I heard Margot yell, "Alex, where are you?" I could dimly see her and Jonathan treading water next to the half-hidden door. I spat out the blood from my mouth. There's something in the water. A coughing fit interrupted me. It dragged me down. God, the taste of blood was awful. I swam towards them, still spitting out blood. Funny to think that I had been so concerned about grossing Jonathan out earlier. And now I looked like an extra from the set of Carrie. The only comfort I had was that, although they hadn't been dunked into the blood quite as thoroughly as me, neither Jonathan nor Margot had escaped entirely unscathed. Margot slid her hand along the door before uttering a triumphant cry and wrenching the door open. I expected the sea of blood to flow down the stairs, but some invisible barrier stopped it. The sea simply split around the open doorway. Only a few droplets of blood spattered down onto the steps leading into the darkness. I peered down. "What color is that?" "Gray," said Margot decisively. "And the staircase before that was red." I admired the fact that she'd had the presence of mind to note down the color of the last staircase while we'd been running for our very lives. Margot added, "This was easy. Sure, if the sight, smell, touch, and taste of blood doesn't make you puke non-stop." More to the point, I glanced at her sidelong and said resignedly, "Did you have to jinx it?" Right on cue, the sea started to ripple and churn around us. Frothy blood sprayed out into the night. As we watched, disembodied arms emerged from the depths and reached for us like sunflowers orienting themselves towards the sun. They were small, like the arms of children, but too thin to be anything human. All of them were white and somehow untouched by all that blood. Once more, I felt hands brushing against my feet. Cold fingers closed around my ankles. "Let's go," yelled Jonathan. "Move it." I reached out to Margot, and just as our hands clasped together, the arms below tugged on me in earnest, forcing my head back under the blood and wrenching my arm painfully in its socket. A brief tug of war ensued. Margot wouldn't let go, so the hands below began to pull her down with me. I wondered for a moment if I should simply let go of Margot's hand. I was the weak link here. After all, the hands held me and not my friends. But fear overrode my noble intentions. I didn't want to die, and especially not like this. My lungs filling with blood and my last sight the white cliffs staring down at me impassively. By some miracle, Jonathan pulled both of us through the doorway. 1 second, my hand slid inexorably out of Margot's, my fingernails leaving deep furrows in her skin as I tried to hang on. Next, my feet were on solid ground. It was strange being on the other side of the invisible barrier that stopped the sea. Occasionally, blood sprayed through and onto us. Not that it could do much worse. Our clothes, our hair, our skin, everything dripped blood and we left puddles behind us. It was going to be even worse when it dried. Jonathan took a deep breath ahead of me. I knew with sudden fear that he was going to speak. Useless knowledge, because there was no way for me to stop him. No way unless I broke one of the rules of the game myself and let go of Margot's hand. "Do you think," said Jonathan, and then he realized his mistake. He clapped his hand over his mouth as if he could stuff the words back down his throat. It was too late. Those 3 words echoed through the darkness and the birdsong abruptly stopped. As if someone had switched it off with a remote, I threw a quick glance over my shoulder to try and gauge how many more steps we had to go. The sight wasn't reassuring. Margot tugged on my hand urgently and I picked up my pace to match hers. Even though this meant that I kept nearly slipping on the puddles of blood. Suddenly, a great wind buffeted us and we were forced to slow to a snail's pace. The wind kept trying to blow us back up the stairs. Hungry shrieks filled the darkness. By then, the flashlights from the backpack were in our hands. but none of them worked save for the one Jonathan held. The sea of blood had ruined nearly everything inside our backpack. Even that one flashlight sputtered in the darkness, on the verge of going out, yet it cast enough light to reveal the birds high above us. The ones that had been chirping and singing. Except, they weren't birds. I caught a glimpse of something staring down at us with insane, hate-filled eyes. Human eyes. A human face. But it had the body of an enormous eagle. It spread its giant gray-brown wings, opened its mouth to reveal needle-sharp teeth, and screamed at us with a woman's voice. Other hungry cries filled the air. How had we ever mistaken that for birdsong? We scrambled down the steps as fast as we could, helping each other up whenever one of us fell. Jonathan dropped the flashlight and it didn't matter. We didn't need to see them to know that they were coming for us. I don't know who fell, Jonathan or Margot, but whoever it was brought all of us down. We tumbled down the stairs, thumping against one painful step after another. It was impossible to keep holding hands. I continued to fall head over heels until I smashed into the ground right beside Margot. I staggered up somehow, my ears ringing. I pulled Margot to her feet. Her eyes fluttered. She was only half conscious and would have slumped right back down to the ground if I hadn't caught her at the last second. Jonathan was sitting up already, holding his left hand out in front of himself. The fall had crumpled it into something broken and bleeding. Between the two of us, we managed to drag Margot with us as we limped to the door. I tugged on the handle, hearing the shrieks growing louder behind us. By now, the ringing in my ears had fully stopped and I could hear what sounded like words in the screams behind us. I pulled on the door handle with all my strength, praying that we weren't too late, praying that we wouldn't feel sharp talons digging into our unprotected backs. And then the door finally opened, and we stumbled through it from one horror to another. Staircase 3. The stench hit us first. The unmistakable aroma of blood, urine, feces, and rot. Bright sunlight illuminated it all in brutal detail. Corpses, stacked together in huge mounds so that they loomed over us and seemed to stretch into the sky endlessly. The bodies were naked, obscenely mutilated. Those that still had intact faces stared at us unseeingly with their cloudy eyes. It was as if some giant hand had carelessly thrown them to the ground. Yet there was a clear pathway between the bodies. It curved to the left and disappeared from our sight. The sky was black with crows. They flew in circles overhead or perched on the corpses they could reach. They cawed merrily to each other and us while they feasted on the dead. Some of them had gorged themselves full, yet they still kept pecking away, tearing away strips of rotting flesh. As I watched, one crow expertly peeled someone's face off, revealing the decaying muscles and fat just underneath. "It's my turn to throw up," said Jonathan. He instantly leaned over and vomited noisily. But I didn't feel disgusted. The sight was too much, too unreal. It was like seeing the pages of some illustrated storybook spread out before us. My mind simply could not comprehend it. If I didn't look at the faces of the corpses, I could pretend they weren't real. I could pretend that they were simply Halloween decorations. Yes, that seemed safe. There was no need to examine them any more closely or to think about how they must have died in pain and terror. Margot groaned. "Where are we?" She started to get up and froze. I cleared my throat. I think it's some kind of maze. A maze? Why? I shrugged. Uncomfortable. I don't know. The way the bodies are stacked. They're like the walls of the labyrinth. I trailed off. I was pretty sure that I was right. It was a labyrinth made of corpses, and the door to the next staircase would be at its center. I glanced at Jonathan. He looked exhausted. Under the sunlight, his hand was even worse than I'd thought. 3 fingers had been bent backwards or sideways into broken sticks, and they were beginning to swell. He tried to smile at me. It's not as bad as it looks. It was exactly as bad as it looked. Maybe even worse. But if pretending otherwise helped him get through this, so much the better. Unlike everyone else, I'd been lucky enough to escape the fall with nothing more than a few bruises. Jonathan and Margot's injuries meant that we couldn't go as quickly as we should have, and we kept running into dead ends. I suppose we could have split up or tried to climb through the gaps in the rotting bodies. But by unspoken agreement, we stayed together. On the path, none of us said anything aloud. But we all knew we were running out of time. I watched the sun tread its path across the sky, leaving behind itself flames of blazing yellow, marigold, and pale pink. It was the most beautiful sunset I had ever seen. I couldn't appreciate it. Its indifferent beauty seemed to mock all the corpses strewn here. Just as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, the corpses woke up. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Someone whispered my name. Alexandra, Alexandra, in a deep guttural voice. I looked around to see who had spoken and stared straight at the corpse on my right. I couldn't help but take several steps back, my mind reeling in horror. It said in its broken voice, "They came from the sky. We asked them to come down, to help us. They rounded us all up and took us into their ships. They killed us, Alex." Another corpse turned its head towards me. The crows had eaten away its nose and lips, but it still had its eyes. They danced with silver fire as it said, "Alex, I watched my son die. They made me watch. They took my son apart, until he was nothing but lumps of flesh. And then they laughed, all around us." The corpses stirred, opened their mouths, and spoke. Most talked about the way that they had died. Others talked about their regrets, their mistakes, their loved ones. They all spoke at once so that it was nearly impossible to distinguish one voice from another. I could only catch disjointed words and phrases. Margot stood by the small mutilated body of a child, whereas Jonathan stared at a corpse that had only a head and torso left. I couldn't hear what the dead whispered to them, and I couldn't pretend that these bodies were just Halloween decorations anymore. If we didn't get out of here soon, I was going to lose my mind. I was about to go to my friends, to tell them that we had to leave right now, when another corpse spoke from beside me. "Margot is lying to you," it said. "What?" I moved closer. Scraps of flesh clung to its weathered skull, and it stared at me with empty, gaping eye sockets. I waited for it to say more. Waited for countless more minutes until I realized that it had said all it would. I shook my head. It must have lied to me to keep me here longer. I ran over to Margot and had to physically drag her away from the dead child, my hand tight on her arm. "We need to go, Margot," I said through gritted teeth. Finally, she stopped struggling to get away from me and turned to give me confused eyes. She asked, "How long has it been?" and sounded close to crying. "I don't know," I replied, "Help me with Jonathan." It took the both of us to tug him away, and by then we were all out of breath and sweating. But we had to hurry. How much time had we lost listening to the dead? We scurried through the labyrinth frantically, trying to keep track of all its twists and turns, keenly aware that our time was running out. When we finally reached the center of the maze, we saw 3 blue doors floating there instead of one. "Well, fuck," said Jonathan, summarizing my own thoughts perfectly. "We'll have to try all of them." I marched forward and opened up the first door on the left. "The staircase in this one is yellow?" "Margot, is that one of the colors?" "No," said Margot. She made no move to inspect any of the doors herself, and I wondered what the corpse had said to her. Jonathan reached out with his uninjured hand to open another one. "This one's blue. So is this one," I said. "Let's try counting the steps." Both staircases had 100 steps. We both looked at Margot then, because she knew the game best. But she simply gazed back at us. Her face was pale and drawn. She looked like a child who had just seen the monster hiding under her bed. "Margot, come on," I said, trying to sound calm even though I felt anything but. "Do you have any idea which door to choose?" Margot shook her head. I don't know." Tears spilled out of her eyes. The doorknob shivered under my hand, and suddenly I was holding something soft and stretchy, as though the doorknob was turning into taffy. I looked across at the door across from Jonathan and saw that it was beginning to melt as well. "Okay, fuck this. We're going in," I said, arbitrarily picking the door closest to Jonathan. I strode over and flung it back open even as the doorknob dissolved in my hand, leaving behind a foul-smelling liquid. "Are you sure?" demanded Jonathan. "There's a 50% chance it's the right one," I said. We all went inside, and as the door slammed shut behind us, enclosing us in that now familiar darkness, I prayed that we hadn't chosen the wrong door. Staircase 4. We braced ourselves to be attacked again. Instead, the same lovely birdsong as before greeted us. We all relaxed an increment, our hands no longer clutching at each other quite so tightly. I couldn't relax all the way though, because now I knew that those things above us weren't actually birds, no matter how much they pretended to be. As we neared what seemed to be the end of the stairs, my heart began pounding an impromptu drum solo. If this staircase had less than 100 steps, or more, that meant I had chosen the wrong door. We could try to run back up the stairs if that was the case, though I didn't hold out much hope we'd make it. Going back upstairs meant breaking yet another rule of the staircase game, which in turn meant something else nasty trying to kill us. At any rate, I'd seen the other door melting, so even if we did make it back up in one piece and re-entered the labyrinth, there wouldn't be anywhere else to go. All I could do now was fervently pray that we were on the right staircase. 98, 99, 100. We came to a halt. I craned my neck over my shoulder to see that the steps had ended. We had chosen the right door after all. Thank God. If the game rules hadn't expressly forbade talking to each other while on the stairs, I probably would have celebrated our luck by cheering loudly. As it was, I wanted to collapse in relief. Scratch that. I wanted to collapse. Period. We're over halfway there, I thought, and tried to squash the hope that followed. I reminded myself that this game probably had tons more unpleasant surprises in store for us. Jonathan opened the door, and a bizarre sight greeted our eyes. We stood in a spacious room completely made of mirrors. The ceiling, the floor, the walls, every inch of it was covered with mirrors. A soft glow illuminated the room. Though we couldn't see where it came from, we could, however, see the white wooden door set at the other end of the room. Like us, it produced infinite reflections. The entire room reminded me of the Infinity Mirror Rooms installation series by Kusama Yayoi. It had that same sense of space and time warping out of joint. Granted, compared to everything else we'd been through so far, walking across a room, albeit a large one covered in mirrors, was nothing. "This is too easy," I muttered. I kept staring at the door, expecting it to vanish before my eyes. It stayed stubbornly solid and annoyingly ordinary, as if someone had happened to pluck it from a house in the suburbs and deposited it here. Jonathan said, "Agreed." There was a moment where we simply stood around waiting for something terrifying to appear. But the only things that moved in the room were our own reflections. It was the first time I'd seen myself since we'd started the game. And I finally realized that we all looked, well, horrible, itchy. Flaking dried blood covered us. Our hair and eyelashes were stiff with it. Our eyes and teeth showed very white against all that reddish-brown blood. If another human being happened to meet us right now, they'd probably run screaming in the opposite direction. I don't know why the thought struck me as so funny. Probably because one thing after another had been chasing us nearly non-stop for the past few hours, and I was near delirious with exhaustion. Once I started laughing, I couldn't stop. Jonathan got it. "Good thing no one else we know is here right now," he said, grinning back at me, even covered in blood. That lopsided smile of his was lovely. My dad would probably have a heart attack. At long last, we were able to sit down and rest for a few minutes. Thanks to the sea of blood, our flashlights, phones, and portable phone chargers were completely ruined. The water bottles and canned food were all right, though the backpack they'd been carried in would never be the same again. "You'd think," I said, while trying not to gulp down the canned peaches all at once. Someone who played the game before could have warned us that the blood would ruin nearly all our supplies, including the flashlights they told us to bring. Why not tell us to bring dry bags? Better yet, why not tell us to bring weapons? Jonathan was too busy wolfing down his own canned peaches to answer. But Margot finally spoke. "It's different for everyone." "What?" "The staircase game is different for everyone. You encounter different things and go to different places. It really depends on what you fear or what you want. The only thing that's the same across all of them is the darkness on the staircases." "And what's in the darkness?" We both eyed her with hard suspicion. But I was the one who asked. "How do you know that, Margot?" She heaved a deep sigh. "I talked to Pharos 7921 before we came here. His real name is Lucian Hammond, and he's played the staircase game a few times now." Before I could respond, Jonathan said with an edge in his voice, "That would have been helpful to know. Oh, I don't know, at any previous point before we started playing this game. Is there anything else you want to share?" I added. Margot shook her head and clammed up again. Frankly, it was eerie to see her so silent and downcast. She'd been able to shrug off everything else so far. Now that we were no longer running for our lives, I personally was struggling not to dwell on the shapes that had broken through the doors in the desert. Although I didn't enjoy being stuck in a constant state of fear. At least then my brain was too occupied with surviving to focus on anything else. "We should get going," said Jonathan unenthusiastically. Yeah, neither of us made any effort to stand up. As the adrenaline receded, fatigue took its place, and my eyelids seemed to weigh 100 pounds. If I could have slept here, with solid reassurance that the door wouldn't disappear on us, I would have had zero trouble passing out on the cold, hard glass. It felt as though we'd been stuck in the game for decades already. Margot stood up and started walking over to the door. Because of course she did. It occurred to me then that Jonathan had been right. She was more focused on winning the game than going home. Her secrecy over what she knew about the staircase game, and her behavior recently, had crossed the line from stubborn straight into obsessive. She went to the door as though she didn't feel the hunger and exhaustion the rest of us felt, or even any pain from her fall down the stairs. Worried, I got up to follow her, only to see that all her reflections stood still, out of sync with her. One of them waved at me sardonically. I heard the sound of breaking glass, as if someone had accidentally dropped a stack of dishes on the floor, or shattered a mirror. Jonathan said from behind me, "Alex?" I turned around. For a full minute, I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. I looked up to Jonathan's smiling face and down to where his hand rested on my shoulder. It was the injured hand, the one he'd been cradling close to his chest while we ate our food. Except it was whole and perfect again. And then I looked at the shard of glass held in that hand. Roughly 6 inches long and 2 across. The shard he'd shoved all the way through my left shoulder. There was no pain. Not yet. I whispered, "Jonathan?" Some instinct made me look down at where his reflection should have been. And I saw another Jonathan staring up at us, trapped behind the glass. My Jonathan. He screamed something at me, but I couldn't hear what he said because the thick glass muffled his words. He started slamming his hands against the glass, leaving bloody smears on it as he tried to punch his way through. And then the other Jonathan pulled the shard back out of my shoulder, and that did hurt. It burned, and the pain cleared my head enough that I could think again. Blood spurted out of my wound as I pushed him away. Or tried to. I couldn't move my left arm at all. It hung from my punctured shoulder, dead and useless. The other Jonathan evaded me easily and wrapped one hand into my hair so he could pull my neck back and dig the tip of the bloody shard into my throat. "Any last words?" he said, mockingly. I was hoping for a snappy comeback to come to mind. The best I could do was refuse to give him the satisfaction of begging for my life. I slammed my elbow into his stomach and heard him give a small oof sound. Then I twisted around and grabbed the shard from his slackening hand. I nearly succeeded in shoving it into his throat. Except by then one of my own reflections had risen out of the mirror behind me like an evil ghost. She forced my arm up and away from the other Jonathan, and then used her hold on me to throw me across the room. On one hand, she'd thrown me towards the door instead of away from it. On the other hand, I couldn't leave Jonathan behind. I scrambled to my feet, shaking my head to try and clear it of the gray spots dancing across my vision. I managed to take 2 steps towards where I could still see him trapped in the mirror. And then Margot yanked me backwards by my injured arm. Pain exploded through it, and I could barely hear her say, "Alex, we have to go. Jonathan's still here." I snarled at her. "We can still save him. Get him out." Even as I said it though, I knew it wasn't true. More of our reflections had stepped out of the reflections of the white doors in the mirrors. 10 other Jonathans, 10 other Margos, and 10 other Alexandras stood between us and Jonathan. And more were coming, an infinite number of them pushing their way out of the mirrors as if the mirrors were made of water and not glass. Those reflections already in the room started running towards us, their eyes burning bright with bloodlust. Margot dragged me backwards. "It's too late, we can't help Jonathan. We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do." I screamed the words so loudly that my throat ached. "Let go of me." She didn't. She dragged me away from the room and through the doorway, towards the final white staircase waiting for us. I watched our reflections stop chasing us. I watched them turn towards where Jonathan was still trapped. They converged on him, dropping down to put their faces right by the glass above him. And the very last thing I saw, before they completely surrounded him and the door slammed shut, was Jonathan staring at us with agonized, despairing eyes, still beating on the glass. Staircase 5. I immediately tore myself free from Margot and ran towards the door. Only rough wood met my fingertips. No doorknob. I tried to wrench it back open anyways, wrapping my fingers around the edges of the door and ignoring the sharp splinters. Right then, I didn't care about the staircase game or its dumb rules. I didn't even care about going home. What I cared about was Jonathan and the way he'd looked at us as we left him behind. And then the door began melting under my hands. No, 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 I thought. I tried to hold it in place. Like I thought the door would turn solid again if I could just make it stay still. Margot touched my shoulder and I shook her off violently, unable to even look at her. Part of me knew she'd probably been right, that there was no way we could have saved Jonathan. At least not without getting ourselves trapped behind the mirrors too. Yet a larger part of me seethed in rage. We could have at least tried. How could she have abandoned him like that? I don't know how long I spent in the darkness trying to get the rapidly disappearing door back open. I did everything I could think of. At one point, I ran to the other side of it and tried to open it from there, alternating between pushing and pulling. I even flung myself through it as it disappeared. That didn't work either. In the end, as the last of the door dissolved in front of my eyes, all I could do was stare at the empty space where it had been half a minute before. When Margot reached out to me, I didn't bat her hand away again. My mind was completely blank. I followed her obediently down the steps because I couldn't think of what else to do. Had I missed some obvious way to open the door? Was it completely impossible to reopen after it closed? Or had I simply not tried hard enough? Halfway down the stairs, I contemplated simply sitting down and refusing to move. Yet that wouldn't bring me any closer to saving Jonathan either. Eventually, I realized that my best bet was to make it through the next door. Maybe there would be more doors on the other side of it. Doors that connected back to the mirror room. So when Margot pulled open the door at the end of the staircase, I didn't try to dash back up the stairs again. I stepped through it without hesitation. and I had to shield my eyes from the warm sunlight that shone down on us. So bright it didn't seem real. As my vision adjusted, I saw that we stood in the center of a beautiful meadow, roughly the size of 2 football fields. Daffodils grew everywhere, nodding cheerfully at us, and the air smelled like spring, green and new, the scent of wet earth and growing things. It was spring here, and it would always be spring. I looked across the meadow and saw a black door, only one and no others beside it, on the riverbank closest to us. The river looked polluted. It was black as well, and it rushed around the whole meadow in a giant loop, enclosing us. The other riverbank, way past the door, was shrouded in a gray, nearly opaque mist. I couldn't make out anything on that riverbank except for a boat of some kind that sat at the very edge of the bank. A tiny, rickety boat that bobbed up and down in the furious current, one stiff breeze away from falling apart. I took a deep breath, the better to yell at Margot, and unexpectedly, contentment stole over me. It was the kind of contentment you feel when it's a cold winter night and you're safely ensconced at home with your loved ones. You're sitting in cozy armchairs beside the fireplace, a really good book in your hands, and you can hear the wind howling and furiously yanking at your windows. Knowing that it's absolutely awful outside only makes you more grateful to be warm and safe inside. That kind of contentment, if I stayed here, I would feel that contentment forever. No more arguments, no more worries, no more fear, ever again. I could let go of all my rage and self-loathing. It was incredibly tempting, and I most likely would have given in if Jonathan's face hadn't flashed across my mind right then. The peace didn't disappear entirely. It simply lessened enough for me to decide that it wasn't yet time for me to stay here. I turned to Margot, ready to shake the answers out of her if necessary. Luckily for her, I didn't have to. She saw the look on my face and said, "I can explain." I glared at her, fists clenched tightly by my side. "I'm waiting. The staircase game gives you whatever you want. That's what Lucian told me. What he didn't tell me is that the game needs a sacrifice before it gives you anything." She took a deep breath. "I saw my sister back there. Alex. I saw her in the labyrinth. She told me that she died because of me." She started to cry again. I stared at her, my anger momentarily forgotten. "That's impossible. Margot. You were 3 years old when she died. She told me that I fell into the pool. That the reason she died was because she went in after me. She helped me get out, Alex, and she drowned in there all by herself." I wanted to tell Margot she must have heard a lie, but actually, it had a horrible ring of truth to it. I remembered the corpse telling me, "Margot is lying." It had been right. Unwillingly, I felt a moment's sympathy for Margot. Margot threw a pleading look at me. The whole reason I even wanted to play this game was to bring her back. I had to keep going. "Don't you see?" Her confession rendered me silent for a few minutes. And then my anger roared back to life and I said, "So you decided to sacrifice one of us. How did you choose Jonathan? Or was it supposed to be me?" "No," said Margot quickly. "I would never sacrifice you." "So what? You didn't give a fuck about Jonathan?" "I chose you, Alex. I chose you and my sister." I shook my head. "No, that's not true. You chose yourself. Like always." Suddenly, I was close to crying myself. Except my tears were born of rage. I had always known that Margot missed her sister. Just because she couldn't remember Marianne that well didn't mean she loved her any less. Yet I had never thought Jonathan and I would have to pay for the cost of that love. How could she have lied to us? How could she possibly stand there, trying to justify herself as if she hadn't condemned Jonathan to being trapped in the game for the rest of his life? Tell me how to get back to the mirror room. I can save Jonathan without your help. I waited for her to respond, only to find her staring past me. I followed her gaze to see the dead walking towards us. They came out of the river. They started out as dark gray figures with indistinguishable features. And then the closer they got to us, the more clearly I could see them. Except they stayed pale and ghostly, like they were barely there. How did I know that they were dead? Because Marianne led the pack. She could have been Margot's twin. Only the slightest of differences set them apart, as if someone had set out to create two identical figurines, and his hand had slipped at the last second. They had the same build, the same heart-shaped face, and the same eyes, except Marianne was taller and her hair wavy instead of straight. She was inexplicably older too. Our age, maybe, or the age she would have been if she'd lived. Margot ran to her. It was my turn to grab for her, to hold her still. She slipped through my grasp like water. I ran after her even though a tiny voice inside my head screamed at me to get out, to leave before it was too late. Even though I was still angry at Margot, angry enough that I never wanted to see her again. I knew somehow that if I left her to the dead, they would do something unspeakable to her, and maybe she'd deserve it. But I didn't want to be the one to decide that. The dead stopped moving. They waited for us to come to them, their eyes as dull and dusty as marbles. Margot finally slowed down when she reached Marianne. She stopped beside Marianne as if she couldn't believe her sister was finally here. I stopped as well, still a good distance back from them. Margot, I called. Get away from them. It was like she couldn't hear me. Or maybe she simply didn't want to. She threw her arms around Marianne and hugged her tightly. Marianne didn't return the embrace. She was as lifeless and unmoving as a doll. Let's go, Marianne, Margot said. Let's get out of here. She tugged at her sister, and Marianne actually walked forward a couple of steps before stopping. Margot dropped her sister's hand as if it had burned her. I can't leave, said Marianne. Her voice was the eerie sound of branches scratching at your window late at night. Nothing human. Stay with us. I knew with instant clarity how the staircase game had interpreted Margot's wish. She'd probably thought, I want to see my sister again. And the game was fulfilling exactly that wish. Nothing more and nothing less. I also knew Margot well enough to predict her response. I screamed at her anyways, even though it wouldn't make a difference. Don't, Margot, don't. Margot didn't even spare me a glance. Instead, she kept staring at her sister, the agony plain on her face. She couldn't go back. She'd lied to herself every step of the way here, telling herself that her friends didn't need to know why she wanted to win the game or even what she would get if she won. She'd told herself that the game wouldn't affect us. And then when she found out that it did, and in the worst way possible, she'd tried to justify it all with simple math. One life was going in and one life was going back out. It wasn't really wrong to do this. If she went back home empty-handed, with Marianne still rotting in her grave and Jonathan worse than dead. That was as much as admitting that she'd made a mistake. That she'd majorly fucked up. And Margot never, ever, made mistakes. Margot licked her lips nervously and gave a single nod. And the dead tore her apart. They reached out with terribly strong hands and they tore off her limbs. Her head. And they dug their hands into all that meat. They ripped her open the way you tear apart the wrapping paper of your Christmas present. She didn't even have time to scream. They sprayed her blood and stray teeth into the air and then they scooped up handfuls of viscera and stuffed it into their mouths, smacking their lips in enjoyment. It was like watching a swarm of beetles and maggots and rats devouring a dead deer. They ate like they'd been starving for 100 years. 1,000. As they ate her, the color returned to their faces and bodies. They looked alive again. And then one of them looked up to see me still standing there. Frozen by sheer horror, they all turned as one to stare at me, like the many heads of one creature, with drooling jaws and vacant eyes. I took that as a sign to start running. I sprinted past them towards the door on the riverbank. To keep the exhaustion at bay, I made myself think about what I'd just seen. The red ruin that Margot had become in a matter of seconds. And told myself that I couldn't die like that. I ran without having any idea if they were still eating her or if they'd started running after me. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. The black wooden door grew closer and closer, until it loomed over me. Impossibly tall. I could hear them now, their feet slapping down on the ground as they tried to reach me before I escaped. I imagined their hands grasping for any part of me, my hair or my clothes or my useless left arm. I opened the door and tumbled through without really seeing what was on the other side. Immediately, I scrambled up to check whether any of them had followed me through the open door. Their hands outstretched into claws and their red mouths gaping. There was nothing there, no door. Just an empty street, an ordinary, empty street that I had walked along many times before, on my way to school or Margot's house. Everywhere I turned, I saw normal shops, normal houses and apartments, normal cars and bikes, normal people going about their everyday lives, laughing or talking loudly. There wasn't a single staircase in sight. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I survived the staircase game. Any sane person would be grateful to simply still be alive. And I am grateful. I am. When we'd first started the game, we'd been so sure of ourselves, so certain that the game would turn out to be either a hoax or completely harmless. We thought we were invincible. We were wrong. No time had passed at all since we'd first entered the game and I came back out. The only survivor. I didn't bother attending my college orientation or any of the classes I'd signed up for a month ago. Instead, I focused on trying to learn more about the staircase game. Yet no matter how hard or how often I scoured the internet and various paranormal discussion forums, I only ever got the same posts I'd already reread 100 times. At one point, I became so frustrated that I reached out to Lucian, Pharos 7921, even though I suspected he'd been the one to dangle Marianne in front of Margot like a carrot. I responded to all his old posts, sent countless private messages to him, all with no response. Either he's ignoring me or he's somewhere where there's no phone service and no Wi-Fi. I wonder if he's playing the game again, and if so, who he's playing it with. The truth is, guilt and self-loathing eat at me every day and every hour. Every minute, and every second of every day. Each night I go to sleep, I'm back in the game. Watching Jonathan scream at me from behind the mirrors or Margot torn apart. I keep wondering why I was the one who survived. I replay everything that happened during the game over and over again, analyzing each moment to see if I could have done something, anything, differently, if there was really any logic to the way the world worked. Then I should have been the one who lost the game, not Jonathan and Margot. Was it really through pure chance, pure luck, that I survived? Which brings me to today. I woke up this morning realizing that there's only one thing left to do. I have to play the staircase game again. You probably think I'm crazy, but I want to, need to, rescue Jonathan. In my dreams, his reflections are hunting him down as he wanders the cold and colorless world behind the mirrors. I need him to know that despite what it looked like, I didn't give up on him. I haven't given up on him. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sacrifice anyone for Jonathan, no matter how much I love him. Unlike Margot, I'm not selfish enough to think that trading one person's life for another's is a fair trade. And even if I did, I wouldn't lie to myself. I wouldn't pretend that I was doing the right thing, or that I had no choice about doing it. That's why I wrote this post. If you've read all of this and believe me, then you know everything that I do about the game. I'm searching for someone who understands the risks. Someone who's brave enough and curious enough to play anyways. Maybe someone who's so unhappy here that they'd jump at the chance to explore another world. Or someone who wants to study the game, run experiments on it and make new scientific discoveries. Or maybe someone who's survived similar supernatural games before. Someone who's always believed in the paranormal and who knows how dangerous a simple game can be. If that sounds like you, please reach out to me. You and I can play the staircase game together. Story. I was a park ranger in a fire watchtower, but I was the one being watched. When I was in my 20s, I took a job as a park ranger at a state park. It was the perfect job for me at the time. I love working outdoors. Every day presented new challenges, and I got to work alone. On days when I could get my work done early, I would find a beautiful spot somewhere in the park and read or listen to music. It was therapeutic. I had just gone through a tough year. School kicked my ass. And I had just broken up with my long-term girlfriend. I needed an escape, and the park provided it. While working during the day was amazing, the night shift at the park wasn't as relaxing. Do you know how uncomfortable the night can make even the most comfortable spaces in your house feel? Well, the pitch black of Mother Nature is like that feeling on steroids. The absolute worst place to sit during a night shift was the North End Watchtower. Everyone who worked there called it the Sentinel, because it was massive and looked out across the whole of the forest that made up the park. It was tall, just over 100 feet above the ground, and made of old pine that seemed to retain the scent as if it had just been cut the day before. It was basically like a little cabin on top of really tall stilts. However, inside wasn't exactly like a luxury box. The wall that faced the forest was one large window that gave pretty breathtaking views but was also really good at giving you feelings of vertigo. Inside, there was relatively meager furniture. There were just 2 chairs, one for sitting in good weather and one insulated one for bad weather, an old desk. A single bare light bulb overhead, and a small fan to help keep you cool. I always brought something to read or write because the night watch in the tower is dull as hell. It was quite a hike, too. It took about 10 minutes or so to walk the 10 stories. When you had to do it in the dark at night, it tended to take a little longer. Each story you climbed disappeared into the darkness below you. It could be a bit unsettling. Once you're on top of the tower, your job for that shift is to basically look for fires or anything else out of the ordinary. When there was a full moon, you could see so much of the woods, but when there was a new moon or cloudy, you couldn't see a goddamn thing. If it wasn't for the bare light bulb in the cabin, you couldn't see anything. Typically, you keep in touch with people on the walkie and just idle away the hours. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I never dozed off for a while. But if you had come to visit me some nights, I might have had sleep creases on my face. Most nights, when I was in the Sentinel, I brought a book and read or a journal to write in. Basically, occupy my mind for the shift and ignore the dark. Rangers, especially older ones, love to tell stories about the weird shit they've seen over the years. People tend to think of parks as safe zones where the most deadly thing that can happen is an animal attack. And, yes, while animal attacks do occur, most of the violence comes from people. Campers, drunk, will get into fights or fall into fire pits, or get lost on their way to the bathroom. Drifters will sneak into the park and stay in unoccupied cabins or buildings. I cannot tell you the number of times I've walked into squatters chilling in a distant ranger cabin and have had to evict them. But one thing no one outside the world of park rangers likes to talk about is that parks, especially at night, tend to be a haven for criminals. I know it sounds crazy at the outset, but it happens. Murders, rapes, drug activity, you name it. It happens. I was lucky to never deal with any of the more heavy stuff, a few times. We found drugs to be sold or a small patch of marijuana growing in the woods, but nothing horrifying. But if you've put your time in at a park, eventually, you'll run across something that will haunt your dreams. Not too far from where our park was, there was a correctional facility. It wasn't Alcatraz or anything that high security, but the people there were serious criminals. It was a distance away, on clear nights. You could barely make out the lights from the yard along the horizon, but it loomed large in your imagination. Your rational brain knew that any criminal could have to brave the dangerous forest in pitch black before they ran into you. But a tiny flicker of light kept a corner of your brain illuminated. It could happen. It won't, but it could. It was near the end of summer, and some of the staff had already split for the year. I was on for a few more weeks. But I was going to get night duty for most of those days since I was lowest on the totem pole. Worse, I would be on sentinel duty those nights. I know having the least amount of seniority was the main reason. But I know that my boss and a few older rangers play poker those nights as well. Since I had no money or skills, I was sent up into the tower. As the sun was starting to set, I walked into the central station at the park entrance. A few rangers were milling about, shooting the shit. The day shift was relaying night shift things they should be aware of. That kind of stuff. It mainly was nothing. Not a ton of campers in the park this time of year. Just a few sightings of bears nearby. Someone also swears they saw a bobcat but wasn't sure. But then someone walked into the station and the tenor of the night shifted. "Excuse me," a woman about 40 said in an overly polite way. She was dressed in leggings. And my guess was she was here to walk the trails. My boss, and want to be Casanova. Jonesy noticed the outfit and lack of a wedding ring and shot her his 10-cent smile. "Welcome to ______ State Park. How can I help you today?" he said, his words dripping with saccharine. Hi," she said, a little taken aback. "I wanted to report something. Well, maybe report is a bit extreme. But just make you aware of something I saw out on the trails." "Sure, what did you see?" She shifted her weight, a little uneasy. "It seemed. I clocked it and thought it was a little unusual. Sometimes when people see a bear or a bobcat, two things that had been spotted recently, they might have their adrenaline pumping and be a bit jittery. But this wasn't that. It sounds crazy. But, I think I saw something stalking me out in the woods. I'm sorry to hear that. Probably gave you a bit of a spook." Jonesy said, "We've had a few bear and bobcat sightings lately." "No," she said definitively. "It wasn't a bear or a cat. I think it was a person." "What trail?" "Sandalwood Loop B, I think it's called. That's not that far from a few campgrounds and fishing cabins." They didn't look like a camper. Everyone in the cabin had stopped talking and turned their attention to the woman. She noticed, and you could see the red rush to her cheeks. "What did they look like?" They looked shadowy," she said, "like they were afraid of the sun or something." "And they were following you?" "I caught something in the corner of my eye around the last turn of the loop. I stopped and pretended to stretch. And I saw something in the woods just off the trail. They were hiding behind a tree, eyeballing me." "Jesus," Jonesy said, "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Thank you," she said, her voice going soft. They followed me until I nearly got to the end of the loop. I started running then and lost sight of them." Jonesy turned back to two of the older rangers and told them to hop in a gator cart and check out the woods for anything. He told them to keep their walkies on and take a sidearm just in case. They left in a flash, and Jonesy turned his attention to the woman. "Can you tell me anything that might help? Did they have any kind of identifiable clothes? Did they speak to you?" "Did they?" she interrupted. "They made noises." "Noises?" Jonesy asked, slightly confused. "Yes, a few. They made a kind of a chittering noise. And a faint, yelling kind of sound. Possibly cicadas." Another older ranger said, "A group of them can scare the fur off a cat. Maybe. I dunno. They also whistled, but not like they were whistling at me. It's like they were trying to blend in with nature." "Can you describe the noise?" "She whistled something that I knew right away. That sounds like a wood thrush." "How do you know that?" Jonesy said, not being able to help himself. "My grandpa was an avid birder." He turned his attention back to the woman. "Did you want to file a police report or—" No, she said quickly. "I don't even have that much information. I just was scared and wanted to let you know just in case." "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "I don't think anyone else was on the trail after me. But I didn't feel right not telling you. I'm so sorry that happened to you here. The park is supposed to be a place to relax." She laughed nervously. Jonesy shot her a calming smile. "Here's my card," he said, handing her one. "If you change your mind, please call me." She pocketed it and nodded. She turned to leave and then stopped. She turned back and, after a brief pause, said something else that was weird. I saw this thing on both sides of the trail. He crossed behind you? I didn't notice him doing that. But he must have, because I saw him on both sides. Unless there was more than one of them, I said, instantly regretting it. Jonesy turned and gave me a, Jesus dude, look. And I clammed up. Do you need someone to escort you to your car? Ma'am? No. I'm right out there. Thanks. Though, she said as she walked out the door. We heard her motor away a few moments later. Sorry, I said before Jonesy could say anything. He sighed. No worries. Just don't go freaking out guests. We need people like her to come back. People like her to come back. Right? Was I too obvious? Jonesy said with a smile. What do you think she saw? I asked. A Wendigo. One of the other rangers said. And everyone laughed, having read about Wendigos and skinwalkers in a mythology class. I didn't find it so amusing. Might have been her eyes playing tricks on her. If someone is out there, those two will find them. They're good at tracking, and whatever is out there couldn't have gotten too far. Great night to be up in the tower, I said with a smirk. That's probably the safest place to be. Jonesy said, no one climbs 10 stories if they don't have to. I hung around for about another half hour or so to see what came of the trackers. They came back and said there wasn't anything around the Sandalwood Loop, no footprints of anything they saw. Granted, the leaves had started to fall, so it was hard to see anything on the ground, but I trusted their tracking skills. Not going to lie, even with the guys coming back empty-handed, I was still a bit nervous about the shift. Jonesy was right, though. No one climbs stairs unless they have to. This is still America. After all, laziness always wins. Also, there was nothing in the cabin above the trees except me. A book, and a journal. Nothing worth making the journey. As the sun slid behind the horizon, I started my trek to the Sentinel. When I got to the platform at the bottom, something caught my eye. The tower base is lousy, with stickers, tags, and names carved into the pine. Usually, it's Joe plus Jane for Eva, or something along those lines. But what had been freshly cut was a bit different. It was a pair of eyes. Had the earlier events not happened, I probably wouldn't have even noticed the eyes. I chalked it up to my mind, already being primed to see some spooky shit. I assumed it had been some kids earlier or one of the older rangers looking to give me a scare. Whatever it was, I did a quick glance around me before I started up the stairs. From the vantage point high above the trees, you can see storms come rolling in. Tonight was no exception. It was a waning crescent moon tonight, so it would be a bit dark. But those rain clouds made it pitch black. The only natural light I would see would be the occasional burst of lightning inside the clouds. The wind had picked up too. You can tell because there is a slight shift in the tower when the winds gust. Not a lot, but just enough to notice. You get used to it. But when it first hits, it can be a bit jarring. There were a few wind gusts, but I settled in for the evening and stopped noticing. About an hour later, my walkie crackled to life. How's the view? It was Jonesy. Great, I said. We're about to do a pass around the park. Wanted to give you a heads up. I leaned forward in my chair and glanced through the window towards the base. I saw Jonesy and a few other rangers getting into their gator carts to head out. Their headlights were bright, but only because there was literally no other light down there. The beams themselves only saw a few feet in front of you. Thanks. You guys need me to scout anything for you? No, we'll be fine. But, hey, if you see any Wendigos, let me know. Huh? Funny, I said. If you hear any thrushes singing, run. Those boys should all be in bed by now. I'll keep that in mind. Be back in a half hour. 40 minutes tops. Over and out, I said, and I placed down my walkie and watched those tiny ants drive off into the woods and out of sight. I kicked back in my chair and started reading again. That's when I heard a board creak. At first, my mind assumed it was probably just the wind pushing the tower. It can cause a creaking sound in the tower. But my brain pushed away the fog of rationality, and a more terrible thought became clear. What if someone was outside the door? I would have heard them walking up the stairs, right? I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, outside of smashing my walkie or flashlight into this potential person's head. There wasn't much. If I did need to escape, light and communication would probably be a good thing to have. Didn't want to go and break essential equipment. I grabbed my walkie and pressed the button. Jonesy, I said, trying to sound confident. Jonesy, you out there? I knew there was a chance he might be out of range. Sometimes these walkies can be wonky in the forest, and I was praying he would respond. But the longer I heard the static, the less hope I had he could hear me. Jonesy, just curious if you guys had circled back this way. Finally, yeah, Ned forgot his light, and we came back, but we're heading out now. Okay, I said. Hey, odd question, but did anyone come up to the Sentinel by chance? Just you, he said, and then added, why? Thought I heard a board creak. It's breezy tonight, storm coming in, probably just the wind, or the Wendigo, he said, chuckling to himself. Have fun, I said, ending the conversation. I put my walkie back down and stared at the door that leads to the stairs. The odds that someone would have walked up here to put a scare in me was remote. Like Jonesy said earlier, no one walks 10 stories unless they have to. But what if the woman from earlier had seen someone, or a group, and they were looking for a place to hide out? Would the Sentinel be a good choice? Maybe. I don't know how the criminal mind works. Regardless, for my own sanity, I would have to swing that door open and see if anything was there. It was probably nothing, but I needed to be sure. If not, the rest of my shift was going to be miserable. I quietly walked across the cabin to the door and grabbed the handle. I counted down from 3 in my head and swung the door open. There was nothing there. In the distance, a flash of lightning crashed, and thunder rolled, but no person was standing there. I sighed and then stepped out onto the landing. You could really feel the breeze up here now. That storm was moving in quickly. You could smell the rain coming. The earthy scent that the raindrops stir up was all around me. Even though I was sure no one was outside the cabin, I wanted to check out the stairs just in case. I walked over to the stairs and stared down. In the darkness, the stories below me just merged with the night. I couldn't see anything. I pulled out my flashlight and shone the beam down the stairs to the next landing. The flashlights we had were decent but not ideal. Cops got 1000 lumen flashlights to shine in your eyes when they pull you over. And we were lucky to get half that. It's not like we'd need adequate lights working in the pitch black or anything. I walked down to the first landing and glanced around. Nothing seemed out of place. I flashed my light down to the next landing, and something caught my eye. The light reflected off of something on the stairs. Not unlike a toddler, I made my way to the shiny object. I was a little surprised to find a small piece of reflective strip on the stairs. I didn't remember seeing it on the way up. I would have picked it up to throw it away. It looked like it had been ripped off of a jacket or uniform or something. But how did this get here? The wind might have blown this up from a campsite. But that felt wrong. It was. I turned to climb back up to the cabin when I froze. On the railing, someone had carved another set of eyes. I didn't move. I stood there as my brain tried to piece together an excuse that made sense. But it was failing, even when I started to feel the patter of rain on my face. I didn't move. What the hell was going on? Fearing that someone might be looking at me, I clicked off my flashlight. I know I said earlier that I didn't want to waste essential tools. But, at this point, I was ready to brain someone until the damn thing broke. The rain started to come down a bit harder, which helped to break me from my fugue state. I was about to start back up towards the cabin when I heard the floorboards above me squeak. There was a crash of thunder nearby, and it barely registered in my mind. I was so tuned into the symphony of pine stairs that a bomb could have blown off near me. And I'd miss it, after what felt like 17 hours. I hadn't heard anything else. I relaxed a little bit. It was probably nothing. My mind was overactive, and I was stringing together disparate events into a cohesive narrative to scare myself. I was sure that was it. Then I heard something drag across the pine above me. It sounded like someone was gouging out the wood. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like jello. I wanted to go streaming down the stairs, but I was afraid I would make too much noise. Plus, the idea of running down 8 stories of now wet steps didn't sound ideal. I slowly started making my way towards the stairs heading down when the gouging noises above me stopped. After a slight pause, I heard footsteps head towards the door of the cabin. Someone was up there. I was sure of it. What they wanted to do? Well, I didn't want to think about that. I slowly started down the stairs, careful to not let any of them squeak underneath me. I kept my flashlight off and just descended into the darkness. I reached for where my walkie should be and cursed to myself when I realized I had left it up there. As if on cue, I heard the cabin door swing back open and heard an object crashing through the trees towards the ground. As it passed me, I heard the familiar static of the walkie. Whatever was in the cabin had just tossed my only lifeline to the outside world. Well, fuck, that wasn't good. I hastened my trip down the stairs. As I rounded the landing for the 6th story, I suddenly heard the familiar call of a wood thrush 3 landings below me. Only, the thrushes were gone at this time of night. This was a person. He made the noise again, and it clicked as to why they would give their position up. He was signaling to the person above me. He was letting him know where I was. 1 above, 1 below. I was trapped. Above me, I heard someone start down the steps. They moved slow and steady. Deliberate. Whoever was up there was coming down to me, and I had nowhere to go. I thought about jumping down and trying to grab a branch on the way, but knew that would end poorly for me in the best of scenarios and deadly in the worst. They rounded the second story down. I was running out of time for a plan. I could run down the stairs and try to bull rush whoever was down there. But the rain was coming down harder now, and we could slip and fall off the tower. The only thing I had going for me was the darkness. I had the only light, and outside of the occasional lightning flash, it was dark as hell. It would cloak me if I could find a spot to hide. As he rounded the landing above me, I made a decision that, looking back, was one of the wildest things I've ever done in my life. I wake up some nights gasping for breath because I dreamed about doing this. The instinct to survive is so deeply ingrained into our animal brain that I suppressed all the fear I would usually have and just acted. As quietly as I could, I climbed over the handrail on the landing and hung off the side of the stairs. My feet felt for the handrail on the landing below me to help steady me. But my toes just grazed against the wood. I couldn't reach them. My arms started burning as they held my weight. I clawed into the wood with my hands, hoping my nails digging into the pine would counteract my wet palms. I closed my eyes, partially to shut out the pain in my arms and partly because I was afraid the whites of my eyes would get noticed. I heard the footsteps turn the corner and start to come down the stairs right next to me. I held my breath. My arms were burning, and I was so afraid I would lose my grip. The person took the steps one at a time, slow as possible. They were looking for me on the landing but didn't see me. Suddenly, whatever it was started chittering into the darkness. A few seconds later, the wood thrush called back. The footsteps stopped coming down the stairs and started going back up. No. In a flash, a solution came to me. I used my right foot to kick off my left boot. Suddenly, I was glad I didn't take Jonesy's advice to keep the laces as tight as a drum. I kicked my boot onto the landing below me, and they landed with a heavy crash. The footsteps stopped going up the stairs. I freed my other boot, and it crashed down next to their partner on the landing. It sounded like I was down there. The footsteps walked right past me, heading down quickly to surprise me on the landing below. As soon as they rounded the corner, I called upon all the strength in my body and quickly pulled myself back up over the railing. I landed with a thud which gave away the ghost. I popped up and dashed up the stairs to the top of the cabin. I knew they'd be right behind me, so I didn't hesitate. In seconds I was at the top of the stairs and outside the cabin door. I was met with another pair of eyes carved into the wood. They stared back at me, watching and waiting to see what I was going to do next. I dashed into the cabin and leaned against the door to brace against anyone trying to burst in. I knew two people, at least I hoped they were people, were coming. And they were going to not stop until they got into the cabin. Another bolt of lightning flashed nearby, and the ensuing thunder shook the tower. Things were close. I glanced up and noticed that someone had carved another set of eyes staring at me just above the window. Only this time, they left a message with the picture. "You watch us." But who's watching you? I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swallowed hard as I heard two sets of footprints reach the top of the landing. Sure enough, they charged into the door, pushing it open slightly. I braced hard against the door and started yelling. Just the most primal screaming I've ever done. They kept thumping the door. WHOOMP. 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 Each thrust pushed the door open a bit more and a bit more. I was struggling to hold out against them. I was tired, and my socks were slipping on the wood. It was only a matter of time until they burst through. I thought about my life. I thought about my parents, my friends, all the things I'd never get to do. Then the hair on my arms started to stand on end. Then my leg hair. Then my hair started to rise. Only, it wasn't fear that was causing this. It was something much more primal, much more natural, much more powerful. I dashed across the room and sat on the insulated stool, a beat-up wooden seat with glass legs, and held my feet up. As the door burst open, I saw two sets of eyes staring at me. The two faces grinned, and the cabin light reflected off the blade of a knife. I screamed as everything went white, and what sounded like the sky splitting in two erupted around us. Lightning had struck the tower. I was safe. Glass and wood are shitty conductors, but the two men who were standing in a puddle weren't as lucky. The blast had shocked them and sent them tumbling down the side of the tower. When I opened my eyes, I could see the burn marks across the pine and smell the fire that had been started. Without giving anything a second thought, I dashed out of the door, careful not to catch myself on fire, and ran down the stairs of the Sentinel. It may take 10 minutes to climb up, but it took me about 2 minutes to get down. As soon as I hit the bottom landing, I saw the lights of the gator carts pull up. I collapsed on the ground as Jonesy and the other rangers rushed over to me. I glanced up and saw his face, and I started to sob. Above him, the flames licked and ate away the tower floor by floor. It would burn for over an hour. I later learned that the two men killed by the lightning were escaped convicts from the jail. Both of them had beat up a guard, grabbed their clothes, and headed out into the woods 3 days earlier. The escape had been kept quiet because they didn't want to spook anyone and thought they'd track them down in the woods sooner rather than later. Why scare people if you didn't have to? Also, fuck that noise. They both had been convicted of murder. And, I swear to God, this is what the police told me. The criminals had ill intent for me. I told the officers I had gathered that. Thinking back, they probably watched me climb up the tower later and saw an easy target. When I had first heard the floorboard squeak outside the door, the criminal that had followed me up made a quick decision to climb up onto the roof of the cabin to prevent me from seeing him until he was ready. I probably didn't hear anything on the roof because of the fan and the rain. I think about what he could have done to me had he caught me by surprise. Jumping down from the roof and shudder. At best, I'd be stabbed by a madman. At worst, I'd tumble 10 stories to my death, either way. Not a great thing to linger on during idle hours. That was my last day as a ranger. I was due back to school in a few weeks, and I needed time to calm my nerves. Everyone understood. They even paid me out for the week, which was nice. I also took a small part of the Sentinel as a memento of the ordeal. Every time I look at the piece of wood I took from the tower, I wasn't reminded of what could have happened to me but instead of what I did to survive. Someone was watching me that night, but it wasn't just the criminals. It was nature herself. Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.